On a moonless September night in 1943, one American soldier made a decision that defied every military doctrine ever written. Armed with nothing but a rifle and a handful of grenades, he would crawl alone through a killing field where 3 German machine guns had already turned his company into scattered corpses. What happened in the next 51 minutes would be so extraordinary that when he finally returned from the dead 20 months later, even the President of the United States would struggle to believe it was real. This is the story of a man who became a ghost, a janitor who wore the Medal of Honor in secret, and the most audacious one-man assault in the history of modern warfare. The darkness before dawn on September 13, 1943, held a peculiar quality along the volcanic slopes of southern Italy, thick and textured, almost solid in its blackness, broken only by the savage geometry of tracer fire that carved red lines through the air above Hill 424. Private William J. Crawford lay pressed against the earth in a shallow depression roughly 35 meters below the crest, his cheek grinding into soil that still held the day's heat, his entire body vibrating with the mechanical violence of German MG34 machine guns that had transformed the hillside into an abattoir. The guns spoke in their terrible rhythm, bursts of 8 to 12 rounds, pauses for barrel cooling, then more bursts, a cadence that Crawford had been studying with the focused intensity of a man who understood that his life depended on memorizing the breathing patterns of machines designed to end it. He was 28 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards, a lean man with weathered features and hands that bore the calluses of farm work and hard living. Before the war, he had been many things: a janitor, a deer hunter in the Colorado mountains, a man who understood patience as a survival skill rather than a virtue. Now, in this moment, with the stink of cordite and torn earth filling his nostrils and the screams of wounded men echoing from positions he could not see, Crawford made calculations that had nothing to do with military doctrine and everything to do with the cold mathematics of staying alive long enough to kill. The company had hit the hill at dusk, confident in their numbers, and the German defenders had waited until the Americans were fully committed before opening fire. The MG34s had been positioned with Teutonic precision, 3 nests forming interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach into a killing box from which there was no retreat and no advance. Men had died in the first seconds, their bodies tumbling down the terrace slopes or simply folding where they stood, and the survivors had gone to ground like rabbits, finding whatever cover the volcanic landscape offered and praying that the darkness would hide them from gunners who were firing at sound and muzzle flash rather than visible targets. The company commander, somewhere in the chaos below, had called for artillery support. Standard procedure: wait for the big guns to soften the position, then advance under the cover of smoke and high explosive. But Crawford knew, with the certainty that comes from hunting elk in high country where a single mistake meant freezing to death, that artillery would take hours to coordinate and the Germans would use that time to bring up reinforcements or simply slip away into the night, leaving the hill contested and the advance stalled. He also knew, though he would never articulate it in these terms, that every minute spent pinned down was a minute in which fear calcified into paralysis, transforming soldiers into terrified animals who would eventually break and run. He turned his head slowly, feeling the grit on his cheek, and studied the nearest machine gun nest. It was perhaps 100 meters upslope, invisible in the darkness except for the muzzle flash that strobed like lightning, casting brief shadows across the rocky terrain. The gun crew would be 4 men: gunner, assistant gunner, and 2 ammunition bearers, positioned behind a stone breastwork or perhaps a natural depression. They would be confident, professional, knowing that they held the high ground and that any American advance would have to come through their fire. They would not be expecting what Crawford was about to do, because what Crawford was about to do violated every principle of military assault doctrine that had been written since men first began killing each other with projectile weapons. He began to move, not toward his own lines but laterally, crawling with his belly pressed flat against the earth, using his elbows and the edges of his boots to propel himself in a motion so slow that it barely qualified as movement at all. This was the patience he had learned stalking mule deer in the Rockies, where a sudden motion meant watching your quarry vanish into timber and going home empty-handed. His M1 Garand was cradled in the crooks of his elbows, and he had stripped himself of everything non-essential. His helmet lay discarded in the depression behind him because he knew that even in darkness, the curve of a steel pot could catch starlight or the faint glow of distant fires and transform him from invisible to target. He had smeared his face and hands with mud, working the wet earth into his skin until he was the color of the hillside itself, and he had tucked fragmentation grenades into his belt where they would not clank against each other and betray him with sound. The first 20 meters took him nearly 40 minutes. He moved during the pauses in firing, when the gunners were changing belts or allowing their barrels to cool, and he froze absolutely still during the bursts, even when tracers passed close enough that he could feel their heat. The volcanic soil was loose and treacherous, offering poor purchase, and twice he felt himself beginning to slide downhill, his fingers clawing for handholds among the sharp stones that cut his palms. The terror of those moments was absolute, the certainty that he would tumble into visibility, that the machine guns would find him and tear him apart while he was helpless to fight back. But each time he managed to arrest his slide and remain motionless until his breathing steadied and he could continue. As he crawled, Crawford's mind worked with the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme danger, when the brain sharpens itself against the whetstone of potential death and achieves a kind of focused purity. He was thinking about angles of fire, about the dead ground that existed in the spaces between machine gun nests where overlapping fields of fire created shadows of safety. He was thinking about the psychology of men under stress, about how gunners who had been firing for hours would become mechanical in their responses, locked into patterns that could be exploited by someone patient enough to study them. He was thinking, though he would not have used these words, about the difference between courage and stupidity, and how the line between them was measured in inches and split seconds. The night was not silent despite the machine guns. Somewhere downslope, a wounded man was crying for his mother, the words slurred and desperate, and Crawford felt each cry like a physical blow but did not allow himself to turn toward the sound. Other voices called for medics, for ammunition, for God, and he blocked them out with the ruthless discipline of a man who understood that compassion in this moment meant death. There were other sounds too, the crackle of small fires where tracer rounds had ignited dry grass, the metallic clatter of equipment being shifted, the German voices calling to each other in harsh syllables that Crawford could not understand but whose tone conveyed urgency and command. He was perhaps 60 meters from the first nest now, close enough that he could hear the mechanical operation of the gun itself, the bolts slamming forward and back with pneumatic violence, the clink of belt links being ejected. The gunner would be behind the weapon, face pressed to the stock, hands on the grips, body tensed against the recoil. The assistant gunner would be beside him, feeding the belt, watching for jams. The ammunition bearers would be behind them, probably below the lip of whatever protected the position, ready to pass up fresh belts when needed. For men, alert and lethal, and Crawford was crawling toward them with the slow inevitability of a landslide. At 50 meters, he could smell them, cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies and the distinctive odor of German field rations. The scent carried downslope on the night breeze, and Crawford used it to refine his sense of their exact position. He adjusted his angle slightly, moving toward a cluster of rocks that would give him cover for the final approach, and as he did so, the moon emerged briefly from behind a cloud bank, and Crawford pressed his face into the dirt with such force that he felt his teeth cut the inside of his lip, tasting blood and soil together while his heart hammered against his ribs, and he waited for the shout that would mean he had been seen. The shout never came. The moon vanished again, and Crawford continued his crawl. At 30 meters, he could see the outline of the gun position, a low wall of stacked stones with the machine gun barrel protruding from an embrasure. The MG34 was a beautiful weapon in its way, capable of firing 900 rounds per minute, fed by belts that could be changed in seconds, accurate out to 2,000 meters with the right mount. The Germans called it the bone saw, and American infantry had learned to fear its distinctive sound, a tearing noise like fabric being ripped at high speed. Crawford studied it with professional appreciation, noting the traverse of the barrel, the angle of the position, the way the gunner adjusted his aim in small increments to cover different sectors of the hillside. 20 meters. 15. The final approach was the most dangerous because it required him to cross open ground with no cover except darkness, and the darkness was beginning to thin as false dawn approached. Crawford could feel time pressing against him like a physical weight, the knowledge that with every passing minute, visibility increased and his chance of survival decreased. He had perhaps 20 minutes before there would be enough light for the Germans to see him clearly, and 20 minutes was not enough time to crawl the remaining distance. He made his decision with the same cold calculation he had used to stalk deer in killing cold. Sometimes you had to take the shot even when the conditions were not perfect, because waiting for perfection meant losing the opportunity entirely. At 10 meters from the nest, he rolled slowly onto his side, moving with infinite care, and pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt. The grenade was a simple device, a steel shell filled with TNT and notched wire that would fragment into dozens of pieces of shrapnel, lethal within a 5-meter radius, dangerous at 10. Crawford held it in his right hand, his thumb through the pin ring, and he studied the position one final time, mapping distances and angles, calculating throw trajectory and blast radius with the unconscious geometry of a man who had thrown thousands of objects in his life and understood how they moved through space. The machine gun fired again, a long burst that stitched the hillside below with impacts that kicked up dust and sparks. And in the pause that followed, Crawford pulled the pin. The spoon flew free with a metallic ping that seemed impossibly loud in the silence, and he counted 1001, 1002. Then threw the grenade in a high arc that carried it over the stone wall and into the position beyond. For a frozen moment, Crawford existed in a space where time had stopped and the only reality was the shape of the grenade tumbling through darkness. And then the world exploded into light and noise and the machine gun went silent. He was moving before the echoes died, not toward the position he had just destroyed but laterally, scrambling toward a cluster of rocks 30 meters to the left, because he knew that the other gun crews would be turning toward the blast, that they would spray the area around the first nest with suppressive fire, and that his only chance of survival was to be somewhere else when they did. He made the rocks as the second and third MG34s opened up together, their fire converging on the area he had just left, tracers crisscrossing in patterns that reminded him of fireworks on Independence Day, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Crawford pressed himself into a crevice between two boulders, his breath coming in gasps that he could not control, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, and he forced himself to wait, to let the Germans expend their ammunition and their fear before he moved again. The silence that eventually fell was not true silence but the absence of machine gun fire, filled instead with voices shouting in German, orders being given, and beneath it all, the sound of men crying out in pain from the first position he had destroyed. Crawford felt nothing for them. Not satisfaction, not remorse, nothing except the cold acknowledgement that they had been trying to kill him and his friends, and now they were not. He had 2 grenades left and 100 meters of hillside still to climb, and the sky was definitely lighter now, the eastern horizon showing the first pale suggestion of dawn. The second nest was 40 meters uphill, positioned on a terrace that gave it excellent fields of fire across the lower slopes but left it vulnerable to attack from above or from the flanks. Crawford began his approach by moving upslope rather than directly toward the position, using the broken terrain and scattered vegetation to mask his movement, and as he climbed, he felt the land itself begin to work against him. The volcanic soil was loose and dry, prone to sliding, and each movement dislodged small cascades of dirt and pebbles that sounded to his heightened senses like avalanches. He moved in increments measured in inches, testing each handhold before committing his weight, and the patience required was almost unbearable. His muscles screamed for release, his mind urged speed, but he maintained the discipline that had kept him alive this far. At 25 meters from the second nest, he found himself in a small olive grove, 6 or 7 trees planted in a line along the terrace, their twisted trunks and silver-green leaves offering minimal cover but enough to break his outline. He paused there, allowing his breathing to steady, and studied the machine gun position with the intensity of a man reading a map to salvation. The gun was firing intermittently now, short bursts directed at targets Crawford could not see, and between bursts he could hear the gunner and his crew talking, their voices tight with tension. They knew something had happened to the first position, but in the darkness and chaos, they did not know what, and their uncertainty was Crawford's advantage. Beyond the second nest, perhaps 40 meters farther upslope, he could see the muzzle flash of the third MG34, positioned near the crest of the hill where it commanded the entire approach. 3 nests, 3 crews, perhaps 12 men total, and Crawford was alone with 2 grenades and a rifle. The arithmetic was absurd, suicidal, and he accepted it with the fatalism of a man who had already committed himself beyond the point of return. He pulled his second grenade, armed it, and threw. But this time, instead of waiting to see the result, he was already moving, sprinting uphill toward the third position with his rifle in both hands and every ounce of strength he possessed channeled into speed. The grenade exploded behind him, and he heard screams and the sudden cessation of fire from the second nest. But he did not look back. The third gun was already traversing toward him, the gunner reacting to his movement, and Crawford threw himself down as the first burst passed over his head, so close that he felt the displaced air like a physical blow. He rolled into a depression, came up firing, and the Garand barked 8 times in rapid succession, the recoil jolting his shoulder, the clip ejecting with its distinctive metallic ping. He did not know if he hit anyone, but the machine gun stopped firing, and Crawford used the pause to sprint forward again, covering 15 meters in seconds that felt like hours, his lungs burning and his legs threatening to give out beneath him. At 20 meters from the third nest, he dove behind a low stone wall and lay there gasping, fumbling to reload his rifle with fingers that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. His last grenade was still on his belt, and he knew that he would have to get much closer to use it effectively, that the throw would have to be perfect because he would not get a second chance. The machine gun opened up again, firing blind, stitching the wall with impacts that sent stone chips flying, and Crawford felt something hot slice across his left forearm. Not a bullet but a fragment of stone traveling at lethal velocity, cutting through his uniform sleeve and into flesh. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Crawford ignored it with the same ruthless discipline he had been practicing all night. He pulled the last grenade, armed it, counted to 2 and stood to throw. But as he did, he saw movement in the position, saw one of the German soldiers raising a Mauser rifle to shoot him, and in that instant Crawford understood with perfect clarity that he was not going to make the throw. So he did something else entirely. He lobbed the grenade at the second nest, the one he had already destroyed, and while it was still in the air, he charged the third position directly, firing his Garand from the hip, working the trigger as fast as his finger could move, 8 rounds in less than 3 seconds. The German with the Mauser went down, and Crawford saw another soldier scramble backward and fall, and then he was at the position itself, vaulting over the stone breastwork with the wooden stock of his rifle raised like a club. What happened in the next 10 seconds was not warfare but butchery, close and desperate and utterly without mercy. Crawford smashed the stock of his rifle into the nearest German soldier's face, feeling bone give way beneath the impact, then reversed the weapon and fired point-blank into another man who was reaching for a pistol. The machine gunner was trying to swing the MG34 around on its mount, but the weapon was too heavy and the traverse too slow, and Crawford kicked him in the chest, sending him sprawling backward over the ammunition boxes. A fourth soldier, young, perhaps 18, raised his hands in surrender, and Crawford gestured with his rifle toward the downslope, and the boy ran, followed by 2 others who had been cowering below the lip of the position. And then it was over. Crawford stood alone in the third machine gun nest, surrounded by dead and dying men, his uniform soaked with blood that might have been his own or theirs, his hands shaking so badly that when he tried to pick up the MG34, he nearly dropped it. He forced his hands to steady, checked that the gun was loaded and functional, and then traversed it downslope and opened fire on the retreating Germans, not from cruelty but from tactical necessity. Every man who escaped was a man who could return with reinforcements. The gun hammered against his shoulder, and Crawford felt a savage satisfaction watching the fleeing figures fall or scatter into cover, and then he stopped firing because there were no more targets and because his hands were too unsteady to aim accurately. He sagged down beside the gun, his back against the stone wall, and for the first time since he had begun his crawl hours earlier, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. Below him, the hillside was coming alive with movement, American soldiers advancing up the slope, using the silence of the machine guns as permission to move, and Crawford watched them come with a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing someone else's war from a great distance. His company commander reached the third nest first, a lieutenant whose name Crawford could not remember, and the man stared at him with an expression that combined shock and awe and something that might have been fear. "Jesus Christ, Crawford," the lieutenant said. "How many of them were there?" Crawford looked at the bodies around him, at the blood on his hands and uniform, at the machine gun that still radiated heat from its barrel, and he felt suddenly, profoundly tired. "Enough," he said, and the word seemed to encompass everything. The hours of crawling, the terror, the killing, the thin margin between life and death that he had navigated with a combination of skill and luck that he knew he would never be able to replicate. The company took Hill 424 with 0 casualties among the men who had been pinned down below the crest, and as the sun rose fully, painting the Italian landscape in shades of gold and amber, Crawford sat in the captured position and cleaned his rifle with methodical care, because that was what soldiers did after battle. They cleaned their weapons, and they tried not to think too hard about what they had done and what they had become in the doing of it. He did not know then that his war was not over, that 3 days later, during a German counterattack, he would be captured and spend the next 20 months in prisoner-of-war camps where the daily struggle was not against bullets but against cold and hunger and the slow erosion of hope. He did not know that back home, when months passed without word of his fate, he would be declared killed in action, or that the Medal of Honor would be awarded posthumously to his family in a ceremony he would not attend. He did not know that he would survive the camps and return home to a country that had already mourned him, or that he would choose to live quietly rather than claim his moment of recognition, taking a job as a janitor at the United States Air Force Academy where he would mop floors and empty trash cans while cadets who studied his tactics in their military history classes walked past him without recognition. He did not know that decades would pass before a cadet who had been researching Medal of Honor recipients would notice an elderly janitor's name on a roster and make the connection, or that on a spring day in 1984, President Ronald Reagan would drape the Medal of Honor around his neck in a White House ceremony attended by generals and politicians and reporters who struggled to reconcile the frail old man before them with the ghost who had crawled through darkness to destroy 3 machine-gun nests single-handed. All Crawford knew, sitting on Hill 424 as the morning sun warmed his face and dried the blood on his hands, was that he had done what needed to be done, that his friends were alive because of it, and that the choice to crawl forward into darkness rather than wait in safety was a choice he would make again, given the same circumstances, because that was what soldiers did. They moved toward the sound of guns, even when every instinct screamed at them to run the other way. The hillside around him was littered with the debris of battle, spent shell casings, discarded equipment, the small personal effects that soldiers carried and lost in combat. Crawford picked up a photograph that had fallen from one of the German soldiers' pockets, a picture of a young woman holding a baby, and he looked at it for a long moment before placing it carefully back where he had found it. He thought about the men he had killed, about their families who would receive telegrams just as American families received them, and he felt the weight of that responsibility settle across his shoulders like a physical burden. But he did not regret what he had done, because regret was a luxury that required the belief that better choices had been available, and Crawford knew with absolute certainty that if he had waited for artillery or for daylight or for reinforcements, more Americans would have died, and their deaths would have accomplished nothing. In the years that followed, military historians would study Crawford's assault on Hill 424 as a textbook example of small unit tactics, the importance of terrain analysis, the value of patience and timing, the psychological advantage of attacking from an unexpected direction. Infantry officers would lecture on his decision to remove his helmet, to crawl rather than rush, to use darkness and silence as weapons as lethal as grenades and bullets. His name would appear in field manuals and tactical guides, always attached to the same lessons about initiative and audacity and the thin line between heroism and insanity. But Crawford himself never spoke much about that night. When pressed by reporters or by historians who wanted to capture his story for posterity, he would shrug and say that he had done what any soldier would do, that he had been scared the entire time, that luck had played as much a part as skill. He deflected attention with the practiced ease of a man who understood that true heroism is often indistinguishable from desperation, and that the decision to move forward is rarely the product of courage alone but rather the calculation that standing still is worse than moving. At the Air Force Academy, where he worked for more than a decade after the war, Crawford became something of a legend among those who knew his identity, a living reminder that valor is not the exclusive province of officers or academy graduates but can be found in the most unexpected places. Cadets who learned his story would seek him out, asking for advice or simply wanting to shake the hand of a man who had done the impossible, and Crawford would smile and tell them that the real heroes were the ones who had not come home, that he had simply been lucky enough to survive his mistakes. He was right and wrong in equal measure. Luck had certainly played its part, the random chance that had kept him unseen during his crawl, the vagaries of German fire discipline, the timing of moon and cloud that had given him darkness when he needed it most. But luck is not the whole story, because countless other soldiers had been presented with the same tactical situation that Crawford faced on Hill 424, and none of them had chosen to crawl forward alone into the teeth of 3 machine-gun nests. What separated Crawford from his peers was not luck but the willingness to act when action seemed suicidal, to move forward when every rational calculation suggested staying put, to trust in his own skills and judgment even when the odds were overwhelmingly against him. This willingness, this capacity to assess a terrible situation and decide that terrible action is better than terrible paralysis, is perhaps the defining characteristic of those rare individuals who receive the Medal of Honor. It is not fearlessness because Crawford was terrified during his entire crawl uphill 424. It is not bloodlust because he took no pleasure in killing. It is something harder to define and harder still to teach, a combination of confidence and fatalism, of skill and determination, of the understanding that sometimes the only way out is through, and that through requires moving toward the things that terrify you most. In the final accounting, what William Crawford accomplished on the night of September 13, 1943, was both extraordinary and utterly human. He did not perform superhuman feats or survive impossible wounds or single-handedly destroy an entire battalion. He simply crawled through darkness, through grenades with precision, and shot men who were trying to kill him, and in the doing of these simple things, he saved the lives of his comrades and changed the course of a small battle in a war that would ultimately involve millions. That such ordinary actions produced such extraordinary results is a testament not to Crawford's uniqueness but to his representativeness. He was, in every way that mattered, a typical American soldier, and his heroism was the heroism of countless other men who made similar choices in similar circumstances and whose names are not recorded in history books or Medal of Honor citations. When Crawford died in 2000 at the age of 85, he was buried with full military honors at Fort Logan National Cemetery in Colorado, the state where he had learned to hunt and to be patient and to understand that sometimes the only way to get close to your quarry is to move so slowly that you become part of the landscape itself. His grave marker is identical to thousands of others in the cemetery. White marble, standard issue, notable only for the small bronze rosette that indicates the Medal of Honor. Visitors who do not know his story walk past it without noticing, just as cadets once walked past him in the corridors of the Air Force Academy. And there is a certain fitness in this anonymity, because Crawford himself never sought recognition and would likely have preferred to be remembered simply as a soldier who did his job when circumstances demanded it. But for those who do know the story, who have studied the terrain of Hill 424 and traced Crawford's route from the depression where he began his crawl to the machine gun nest where he ended it, the grave marker is a reminder of something both inspiring and sobering, that ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances can accomplish impossible things, but that the cost of such accomplishments is often higher than we can imagine, measured not just in physical scars but in the weight of memory and the burden of survival. Crawford carried that weight for more than 50 years, and if he bore it quietly, that quietness was itself a form of heroism, the choice to live with what he had done without demanding constant affirmation or recognition, to accept that some things can never be fully understood by those who were not there and should not be glorified by those who want simple stories about courage and victory. The true legacy of William Crawford is not the Medal of Honor or the tactical lessons that bear his name or even the specific actions he took on Hill 424. His legacy is the example he set of how to carry the weight of what war demands, with humility, with grace, and with the understanding that heroism is not an end in itself but simply what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that impossible situations justify inaction. He crawled forward when others stayed down, and in that crawling, he saved lives and changed outcomes and demonstrated that the space between fear and courage is not a vast gulf but a distance that can be measured in inches and crossed one slow, terrifying movement at a time. On the hillside in Italy where it all happened, nothing now marks the exact locations of the 3 machine gun nests that Crawford destroyed. The stone walls have crumbled, the trenches have been filled by time and weather, and the olive trees have grown or been replaced, transforming the battlefield into simply another section of agricultural land where farmers grow their crops and tend their livestock without knowing that beneath their feet lie the scattered relics of a night, when one man's refusal to accept defeat changed the course of a small battle in a war that changed the world. But the hill itself remains, patient and enduring, and if you stand on its crest and look downslope toward the depression where Crawford began his crawl, you can still see the terrain he crossed, the open ground he traversed inch by inch, the rocks he used for cover, the line he drew between himself and death and then erased by moving forward into darkness. That line is Crawford's true monument, invisible but indelible, drawn in courage and fear, and the simple human refusal to let impossible odds dictate action. It is a line that countless other soldiers have drawn in countless other battles, and it is a line that will be drawn again by those who come after, because war creates the conditions that demand such drawings and humanity provides the individuals willing to draw them. Crawford's gift to us is not the Medal of Honor or the tactical innovations or even the specific memory of his actions, but the reminder that when the line must be drawn, there will be those who step forward to draw it, not because they are fearless or invincible or in love with death, but because they understand that some things are worth the risk of everything, and that friendship and duty and simple human decency sometimes require moving toward machine gun fire rather than away from it. In the end, that is the story of Hill 424. Not a story about invincibility or superhuman courage, but a story about a man who was terrified and exhausted and outnumbered and who decided that those conditions did not excuse him from trying, that his fear and his exhaustion and his impossible odds were simply the circumstances in which he would do what needed to be done. He crawled forward, and in crawling, he became something more than himself, not because he was seeking glory or recognition but because the crawling was necessary and he was there and he was capable, and those things in combination created an obligation that he could not refuse. That obligation and the willingness to meet it is what we honor when we remember William Crawford. Not the killing or the violence or the destruction, but the choice, the simple, terrible, magnificent choice, to move forward into darkness because his friends needed him to, and because moving forward was the right thing to do, and because being the kind of man who moves forward when others cannot is, in the final accounting, the only kind of man worth being. William Crawford's story reminds us that true heroism often wears the most humble faces, that the janitor mopping floors might carry more courage in his heart than we could ever imagine. His journey from that terrifying crawl up Hill 424 to the quiet dignity of his later years teaches us that valor is not about seeking glory, but about doing what must be done when no one else can. If the story moved you, if it made you think about courage, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who walk among us, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing these remarkable stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think gave Crawford the strength to crawl forward when every instinct told him to stay down? Was it training, character, desperation, or something else entirely? And have you ever met someone whose quiet exterior concealed a profound story of courage? Share this video with someone who needs to hear about real heroism. William Crawford's story deserves to be remembered, and perhaps in remembering it, we honor all those who have faced their fears and moved forward regardless. Thank you for watching, and never forget, heroes walk among us, often unnoticed, always extraordinary.